The Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Adam Bearne, and this is the Square Circle. Hello and welcome to the Square Circle. I'm your host, Adam Bearne. Joining us today, we have libertarian and Florida attorney, Addison Hosner. Hi, Addison.
Hi, Adam. Thanks for having me today.
We also have conservative writer, Peter Pischke. Hi, Peter.
Howdy, y'all.
And lastly, but not least, we have progressive Edwith Theogene of the Center for American Progress. Hi, Edwith.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Well, you're very welcome. Welcome, everyone. On Thursday, Russia began its invasion of Ukraine. Russian President Vladimir Putin claims that his special military operation is to protect two regions of eastern Ukraine that Moscow recognizes as independent. But the international community is condemning the invasion. US President Joe Biden and the leaders of other nations have imposed additional sanctions on Russia in an attempt to end the violence. So, Edwith Theogene, there is war in Europe tonight. Did President Biden underestimate Vladimir Putin, or were these sanctions never going to stop what he wanted to do?
Yeah, first off, I just want to say that this is such a horrific act of aggression towards a peaceful neighbor. So I know that thoughts and prayers are never enough, but just want to keep the people of Ukraine in mind. To answer your question, Adam, the Biden administration's response to this crisis has been incredibly strong. First, they were one of the first ones to sound the alarm back in the fall when they saw Russian moving forces. And then second, they have engaged with our allies and built a united front. So they've joined with the chorus of voices in condemning what has happened. We'll see this clearly again tomorrow, Friday, when Vice President Harris leads the American delegation at the Munich Security Conference. And third, the Biden administration surged military support to Ukraine. Ukraine is now the third largest recipient of US security assistance in the world after Israel and Egypt. And lastly, the Biden administration told the Russians, let's talk, let's negotiate, but the Russians were not interested in talking. It's scary to think, but this possible war is the fault of one man, Vladimir Putin. He has rejected all efforts to negotiate. Instead, he looks determined to invade a smaller democratic neighbor who wants a democratic future and not an autocratic one. And we need to respect that and value what the people of Ukraine want. What we need to do if Russia invades is impose economic costs on the Kremlin, which is part of the strategy around the sanctions. We need to go after the corrupt oligarch money that has corrupted our politics and our economy. We need to provide support to Ukraine and its economy and its military. And we need to keep pushing Russia to climb down and come to the negotiating table.
Peter Pischke, where are you on that? Edwith says that these sanctions have been incredibly strong. The Biden administration's response has been strong. Do you agree?
Not particularly. I think more on factual grounds. But to be fair to everyone, with Putin, it's really hard to tell if there was anything really that could be done totally to stop this madman from enacting his grand plan. He's someone that's long believed that his role is to bring the empire of Russia back to its glory days. So I don't know if there is technically someone you can really work with. But as sanctions go, the ones that Biden has put forward with the support of NATO have been incredibly weak. For example, they are missing all sorts of areas that would have more of a kick to them. For example, in these sanctions, and he started with what he's referred to as tranches, they've gone after certain financial institutions, but for the most part, they are going where they're most heavily hit. For example, it doesn't affect the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, which is SWIFT, which is the technology that many banks in Europe, especially Russia, rely on for finance. That is completely ignored. And Biden has said the reason they didn't want that was because some members of NATO were uncomfortable with that. So, again, fairness to Biden, he is working against a lot of people here, even on his own side, that don't really want to do the work of it. And that wouldn't be new. Germany has long been someone that might have had responsibility in this, and they've deferred their role in all this. The U.S. to some degree has as well. even though we had an agreement in the 1990s in 1994 in Budapest that if Ukraine ever got in trouble, that the U.S., the U.K., and the rest would come to the rescue. And just like how we failed to really keep our word on that end, the sanctions we are putting out are pretty weak sauce. And to quote Napoleon, if you're going to take Vienna, take it. If you're gonna go with the sanction route, you just gotta go whole hog, man. You gotta make it really hurt. But there are certain parties that President Biden has to deal with that don't really want to be that uncomfortable.
So, Addison, you've heard from our other panelists that the sanctions have either been incredibly strong or very weak. Where are you on that?
Well, I mean, clearly the sanctions aren't impacting the desire of Russia to stage their invasion. Some of the footage coming out from Ukraine is horrific. It's an absolute tragedy what's going on. And we can talk sanctions all we want, but I think something that needs to be stated here is that a lot of the Russian citizens themselves are against this war. As we speak, there are thousands in Moscow and St. Petersburg right now protesting, risking life and imprisonment from a Russian government that doesn't want them to protest this peacekeeping mission, as it was initially labeled. I think something of note should be considered is that the sanctions that were just levied no more than a few hours ago before we started broadcasting are against Belarus, which is a neighboring country of Russia and Ukraine, which has assisted Russia in this endeavor. I think the sanctions need to start turning in that direction. We need to start targeting those who are assisting Russia, because Putin has made it very clear that the threat of sanctions isn't enough to deter him from trying to do what he wants. And unfortunately, by continuing to sanction Russia, especially by economic sanctions that will impact the global market, we're looking at not only an impact on Russia to help prevent the war, but eventually it's going to come back to us here stateside as well as the rest of Europe. And, the suffering will continue, not just from Ukraine, but around the world. So sanctions, I think, are a good step to try to curb behavior. But when that behavior isn't being deterred from those sanctions, we need to start looking at another avenue. And unfortunately, Russia is very aware of this. The NATO nations right now are not in any position to invade or send our own troops to defend Ukraine. So we're kind of in a catch-22 of what do we do and how do we ramp this up to generate the serious nature of what Putin has actually done. So I'm right in the middle on where we stand.
Okay, and I should just tell our regular listeners and viewers that who expect usually 3 different topics on a typical Square Circle episode, that we are focusing on Ukraine today. So we'll stick with that. And Edwith, I wanted to give you a chance to respond to Peter Pischke, who disagrees with you that these sanctions have been strong. He's bringing up the SWIFT code system in the banking sector. Failing to cut Russia off from the banking sector at the moment appears to be a choice or a division among NATO members and the G7 countries. And also, you mentioned that we should be cutting off Russian oligarch money that's coming in and corrupting our politics. Why hasn't that happened already? If Vladimir Putin is the one giving the orders to send troops into a neighboring country to upend their democracy, why isn't he being targeted specifically, do you think?
Hi, thank you for asking that question. I think a lot of people have been saying that we wish these sanctions could have come earlier. We wish that we could have come out strong, but we can't really take that action. It doesn't make sense to take that kind of action without them already creating like the negative action, which is to invade Russia. So I do disagree, and I support the fact that these sanctions are happening and that the administration is responding very decisively and very quickly with what's happening right now.
Okay, and Peter, to come back to you, you highlighted some of this disagreement that exists between G7 members, NATO members. What risks do you think there are going forward? It feels like different countries are willing to take different levels of pain. Germany, for example, by cutting off the Nord Stream 2 pipeline of natural gas that's coming from Russia, it's supposed to be coming online any day. It looks like that's not going to happen now and will likely result in much higher energy prices in Europe. Is there a risk that there will end up being a division among the transatlantic allies on this?
Yes, extremely so. I think we're already seeing that. And a lot of it has to do with the history of the countries. A lot of it has to do with geography. For countries who are in the middle of Europe or part of Eastern Europe, the distance between Belarus, which is helping with the attack on Ukraine, and a place like Prague is about the same distance between Washington, D.C. and Chesterton, South Carolina. I mean, to us, we're used to living in these bigger countries, well, at least us United States people, and it feels like wars and stuff are far off. But for the people who are living in Europe, my brother who served a mission in Romania, he has friends in Romania that are following this and they're disconcerted. They're worried because they know that things could get messy. Maybe if someone is going through Ukraine, they're a Russian fighter, and maybe they miss their mark and they end up getting, a little bit in Romania. These are all kinds of concerns they have. Unfortunately, while the countries that are right immediately there, places like Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Macedonia, Romania, while they are definitely feel it, some of the other European allies don't feel it as much, and some of them are just downright unwilling to cooperate. Germany is like near the very top of this list. It's the fourth largest economy in the world, and they were the ones, of anyone, that might have helped prevent what happened this week from happening, and they just don't want to do it. And even with, you mentioned Nord Stream 2, that's only technically right now a formal suspension, and there is an entire promise that they aren't going to end up going back to Russia for more oil anyways, because they've never proposed a solution to replace it. So unless they come up with something new, they're going to have to end up going back to the same source. And at all previous efforts, that's what Germany's done. Even when Macron's like, what the heck are you guys doing? And he's like, one of the more aggressive ones in the EU, or when we pointed it out, it didn't seem to make much difference. I'm Prussian, my family's Prussian, and we Germans, we're very stuck in the mud. We do not like being told what to do. And unfortunately, I think there are some members of NATO, besides that they just don't want to carry their weight and pay for the defense spending, they just aren't willing to do things that will make it uncomfortable for everyone, including themselves.
Yeah, and I was going to talk about, and we'll move on to talk about the US troop deployments that we shortly be seeing to Europe, we believe. But you bring up a good point there, and I wonder, just talking about the situation in Germany, where, of course, Angela Merkel, longtime chancellor, has gone. Olaf Scholz, the new chancellor, this is his almost the first thing to deal with since he gets his feet under the desk. And I wonder, Peter, and anybody else who wants to jump in, has Putin timed this perfectly in a strange way, in that Germany has a new chancellor, the French president, Emmanuel Macron, he's up for re-election this year, and the US have midterm elections coming up. Has Putin looked at this and said, now is the time to strike because these other countries will run out of patience?
You want me to jump in there?
Yeah, sure. I mean, just because you brought up the point about Germany, I just
I think that is definitely one of the factors that are in it. He's been testing the waters. After Afghanistan, there was a strong message. Both China and Russia, Putin and Xi, met a number of times. It's theorized that they have been definitely thinking about this plan for a while, and it really started to come to reality that they could do this after we left Afghanistan. The sorry wave that we did. I don't totally know what's in the mind of Putin. Putin is working really hard, and the Russians in general, to not let any information leak. And they're not even allowing diplomatic channels generally. So like Zelensky has tried who knows how many times to get in contact with Putin. And
the Ukrainian president.
They just would not take it. Yeah, sorry. My apologies. Yeah, Zelensky is the Ukrainian president who is former comedian TV host of Ukraine. Just kind of crazy unto itself.
Yeah, that seems to be going around. Addison as well, I wanted to just get your thoughts on that. Is there something about democracies that we need to address where we can often be distracted by things at home to the extent that potentially we let autocrats like Putin end up getting away with what he's doing right now?
Yeah, I mean, we get distracted by so many things, right? As of the last 4, 5, 6 years, it seems like any headline is deterring us from taking a look at what's happening around the world. I look back to 2014 when Putin made the move on Crimea. That was a major moment that happened at the tail end of Obama's administration. And then just this past, 2 years ago now, in 2020, Russia passed a referendum with a 78% yes vote from the citizens to allow Putin to remain as president of Russia, to run for an additional 2 terms until 2036. That's never been done before. And I think right now, to follow up on the previous question of, was he waiting for this moment? I think he feels pretty good about his position. He made that move about 8 years ago, kind of stoking the fires with Ukraine. He's been testing the waters. he's been realizing over these last at least a month or so, maybe longer, that he can keep prodding the bull and nothing seems to happen. And meanwhile, he thinks he has the support of his people. And that's where I think those protests and things are going to really start weighing in on this. Putin, I don't think he's as calculated as people give him credit for. I think he's a little reckless in how he handles himself, but he is aware of his own approval ratings and what can possibly happen. Now, in a regime that's propped up by the amount of corruption that his is, what good is a vote? What good is actually getting him out of office? But he doesn't want to lose the support of his people.
President Biden has said that US troops will be sent to those allies on the eastern flank of NATO. Most of them, it seems, will be moving from places like Germany and further east to Poland and to former Soviet states like Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia. Peter Pischke, I wonder, is that the right move? Should we be sending more troops to the region? What's your view on that?
My view generally is that we should keep the agreements that we've made, and we have made agreements with many of these countries. We encourage them to get into NATO. We've made promises both in law and verbal many times to these countries. We gave them to Ukraine, and frankly, we probably should have done more so it didn't get to this point, but now we're here. The one positive I think that comes from this is that this really did wake up a lot of people in NATO, and so we are sending troops, and there is going to be, like I said in an earlier comment, there just wasn't a lot of willingness to take on Putin. Well, now there is more willingness. Is there enough? Probably not. But there's more of it. And I think that we should be investing in these NATO countries. We should be strengthening where we can. But it's going to be a difficult thing. The problem is, as this is human nature, once you've caved one time, people are going to assume you're going to cave again, and that temptation is going to be there. So I don't know how you prove you're serious and that we really mean it. We will really defend this country this time. If Putin after this is looking at Romania is like, looks pretty good over there. How are we going to put out real deterrence? That will be a tough trick to perform for any leader.
So it doesn't sound like you're necessarily saying that the US should send additional troops to Europe. It's just more about maintaining the commitments we already have.
So there's what I think would be wise and what I would do if I was in that situation. If I was in that situation, I would send more, I would support more. But I honestly, for the long-term approach, Europe needs to pick up the slack, especially Germany. These countries they've also been in these pacts that we've made with them, and they have rarely held their weight. At the very minimum bar, if you're part of NATO, is that you're supposed to provide 2% of the total defense spending, just 2, and only 9 of the 28 countries actually do that. And we have to. I mean, I had my own issues with President Trump, but at least give him credit. He was trying to, pull some teeth and maybe get a few of them to spend a bit more. And I don't think we can stop this just as the United States alone. This is going to have to be for Europe to solve. The United States could be part of that, and we could be strong and help lead the way. But ultimately, it's going to be our friends in Europe that are going to have to make the ultimate decisions whether Putin's going to be able to move forward more and take more and do more evil or not.
And Addison Hosner, as a libertarian, I'm wondering how you feel about this potential of having more troops in Eastern Europe to our NATO allies, including right up to the flank of Russia, which is, of course, what NATO members have been criticizing Russia for doing with their own build-up on the border of Ukraine.
Well, the big libertarian position has always been in foreign policy, don't stick our noses where it doesn't belong. And this is a tough one because, again, Ukraine, while they're not a member of NATO, they've been wanting to be a part of pretty much that organization. They've been wanting to be a part of Central Europe and distance themselves from their former Soviet roots in Russia. I don't condone sending American troops in there. I don't condone us losing lives for that war. However, to follow up on Peter's point, we do have an interesting dilemma of not creating a show of power or any type of force. And as we touched upon earlier with the sanctions, if nothing comes from this and Russia realizes that they can walk in, take territory away, cut off supply lines, and the worst that happens is some sanctions that eventually might get backtracked due to the leverage they might have to defeat those. I think that's problematic. The future of the world order is potentially going to be disrupted here. And moving forward, I don't think military techniques from us is going to be the most pertinent and prudent way of going forward. I do agree with Peter, though, that the European nations should pick up some slack as it's closer to their borders and their neighbors. But by all means, I condone America to stand by them and agree to our agreements and our alliances with them.
Edwith Theogene, I should have come to you before. I saw when Peter was talking that you were jumping out of your chair to respond.
Yeah, I think Peter articulated some of the stuff that I was going to say as well. I mean, Ukraine's membership to NATO has been basically on ice since Russia invaded, and their relationship with Russia, I think, since 2014. So if they do actually become a member of NATO and they're currently at war, that does call upon all the other countries and folks who are part of NATO to respond to that. So I'm never going to say that war is the answer. And I don't think that, I mean, it's a hard situation because we want to make sure that people are safe and protected, and the sovereignty of a country is definitely being being challenged. So I think I do agree with folks too, that our European neighbors need to pick up the slack, but then also the United States has also made a commitment to that organization and to the countries that are part of that organization.
I do want to move to questions from our viewers and our listeners who are sending some in about this. And the first one comes from Amber Cannon, who asks, is there any scenario that would justify sending US troops into Ukraine? I'll leave that open to anyone who wants to jump in.
I guess theoretically, if nuclear arms are used, if it gets to the point where there's a pretty high threat of nuclear enforcement, that might push people's hands. If he chooses to invade another country, or something really, really bad goes down, and I mean, we're already at really bad, but if somehow this escalates dramatically, maybe that would be what push it. I think Addison is correct on this. I don't think there's a lot of political will for something like a full-on invasion. To Biden's credit, he had followed some of what the Trump administration was doing and trying to enable to arm the Ukrainians that want it, and that has been partially successful. Ukraine has made an effort that I've just read that they said in one day alone they think they armed 10,000 people. So there have been efforts that we've been that have been working, but that ultimate thing of, are we going to put our own soldiers on the ground? Something would have to happen that shakes things up so that would become a reality, because right now it just seems untenable.
Addison Hosner, as a libertarian, I can't imagine you're clamoring for US troops to be sent to Ukraine.
Not without direct provoking of our own armed forces. I agree with Peter's sentiment on this one. I do think this is kind of also happening right now. Interesting enough, with China and Taiwan. China was flying some military planes today in Taiwan's defense air zone, and Taiwan had to issue a warning to China. Now, if what's happening in Ukraine were to happen down there, we have military bases and operations down there. We have much more at stake, especially with supply lines. Taiwan's responsible for almost 90% of all the high chips that are used in a lot of our electronics. So that would disrupt an entire global supply chain even more than it already is. And if that were to occur, then who knows? I mean, now we're talking global war, and I can't condone getting involved in anything, especially after what so many of us have grown up with. Since I was 10 years old, we've been involved in war. So it's something that I really hope we can avoid it. And I don't believe that what's happening in Ukraine will escalate to the point where we have boots on the ground. Again, like Peter said, if there's a threat of nuclear weaponry, something's going to happen. But I'm not sure then it would go through Ukraine. It would go directly to Russia. And that's the last thing we need, is two hegemon powers going at it.
Yeah, it's frightening that we're even considering the prospect. Edwith, would that be the level you think we would need to reach for US troops to be confronting Russians directly?
Yeah, I guess I join the chorus that's here in this conversation, that I would have to take the threat of nuclear war. But at the same time, I hope we do not get to that point. It's always interesting to talk about war and what's happening in other countries when you're either not from there or, excuse me, from there or live there, anything like that. Peter, he has a connection to that area, so I can see that. Anyways, the point that I'm trying to make basically is that I don't want to see us go to war. And I know that there are people who are suffering who are there, and we definitely want to help and make sure that they're okay and do whatever we can and be the most valuable ally and support that we can be as a country. But I hope it doesn't come to military forces being like sent over.
Okay, well, let's move to a second question, which comes from Glenn Mack. And Glenn is asking, how do small government types feel about sanctions? They're a projection of government power. And I guess that's more aimed at Peter and Addison on this one. Peter, do you want to chime in there first? Sanctions, are they a tool of big government?
I guess, yeah. I mean, basically, I think when it comes to foreign policy and things like war, sometimes the moral math changes, but they are something that, to Addison's credit, you should be incredibly responsible over and think through, because sanctions often have a way of sticking around, like many things in government. But sometimes that's the only tool you have at hand. Sometimes that's what you have to use. And again, you have to do it incredibly responsibly. You have to be, you have to be good stewards, good leaders, and you have to be willing to say, okay, here's the reasoning while we're having it, and here is when we want it to go away. It's a tough call, and sometimes I even wonder, because there are things like what President Trump was trying to do with China, which wasn't effective at all because it wasn't honestly all that sincere. But theoretically, would I be okay with that? And I can see arguments on both sides. And like I said, these are very tough calls, and I would just want whoever is making these decisions, and I hope they're wise people doing so, that they think them through thoroughly, and that they stay in the parameters that they're setting.
And Addison, your thoughts on sanctions potentially being an abuse of big government power?
Well, in the context of what we're discussing here, sanctions being used against a potential enemy state, I think there's some fundamental roles of government. And the libertarian or classical liberal perspective on how government works, yes, we believe in limited government to the extent that it doesn't infringe upon your personal liberties. And as long as you're not doing anything in your personal life that's affecting others, well, on your social rights, that should remain untouched. But when it comes to the federal government, they do have some roles to play. Without a federal government, there's certain things that we cannot provide for. One of those is a national defense. So in this situation, by sanctioning Russia, and which has I'm assuming the question is targeted at the fact that has a global impact on the economy, which then affects your standard American. So the overreach of government sanctioning a nation then affects the economy in our country. Thus, your rights are being violated. I'm assuming that's what the argument would be. I could be off there. However, I don't think that this is an overuse of a bad discretion of use of government to sanction Russia. It's something that, frankly, we've discussed it in length today. Without this ability to remedy the issue, what are we left with? We're left with military recourse, which, if you're a champion of limited government, that should be the last thing that you want, is to cause invasion. Now you're having the industrial military complex be propped up even further, which increases governmental spending, and now you've done the exact thing you hope to prevent. So in this situation, sanctions, I think, are extremely, they're a tool that we need to just acknowledge as part of, global politics.
And yeah, Peter wants to come back in, but we will get Edwith's thought on it as well.
Sorry. I was just going to add, my answer was pretty broad to the idea of sanctions in general, but places like Russia and China specifically, there is a liberating argument to ask about what those countries are enabling. China, both of these countries, especially Russia, have a huge role in a lot of criminal enterprises across the world, especially in the digital sphere. So much of the identity fraud, so much of the black market type behavior. A lot of that comes to these states. They're basically state sanctioned, and Russia in particular is, in so many ways, a kleptocracy. They are very much tied into things like money laundering. They engage in very heinous things that take away liberty from people all over the world. With the China and Uyghurs. So sometimes the argument is, with sanctions, are we going to sanction these people because we don't want to engage with them or don't want to benefit them because they are acting in really, really horrible, heinous ways? I think that does change the argument somewhat. Sorry.
Okay, and Edwith. No, let's go to Edwith Theogene, because the question might not have been aimed at you, but I do want to get your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with some of the stuff that folks have shared. I mean, sanctions are a big lever of power that we have to use. And I agree that it's something that there's steps, right? People just don't jump into war like Putin, but there are steps. And we hope that our leaders are smart, strategic, and thoughtful about how they take those steps and what levers that they use. So I believe that the sanctions, the way that the Biden administration administered it, they did the best that they could do in that moment, and it was a sound decision. And we are trying to prevent the invasion from continuing on. We are trying to stop the escalation of this situation, and applying a sanction makes sense to me. I think also this question of big government or not, and like this is an overreach of government. The point that I was trying to make earlier was basically like it's so easy to say we're not going to war when you're not directly involved or live in those communities. So this right now in this moment, this is one of the best things that the United States can do, is to put a sanction to make sure that that folks are not getting the resources that they need to escalate a situation and go into war.
Well, thank you, folks, for your thoughts on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is obviously our only main focus this week on the Square Circle. But we do still want our listeners and viewers to perhaps hear something that they're not hearing anywhere else. And that's where our guests tell us what they think is the most underreported story of the week. Edwith Theogene, do you want to give us yours first?
So underreported story, I think I have can I do 2 stories?
We don't usually allow it, but it's our first time with you hosting, so go ahead. We're getting the thumbs up from everyone. Let's have 2. Come on.
All right, because one is sad and one is good. So
we need them both then.
Yeah. So one that I'm really excited for is that the U.S. national women's soccer team, they won the $24 million settlement in equal pay. So congratulations to the U.S. women's soccer team. I thought that was really amazing because they did so much great work and they were underpaid. And then, so that's the good news first. The bad news that I think is underreported is that there are thousands of HBCUs across the country who've been receiving bomb threats. The FBI just released a report earlier today talking about how HBCUs and places of worship have been increase in bomb threats. So I thought that was something to share for folks to look up and read more on and be aware.
Light and shade there for sure. Peter Pischke, what about your most underreported story of the week?
This is kind of my most underreported story for the month, but people have been following it. The opioid crisis, the interest on it right now is waning somewhat now that the settlements have come more firmly together. But that is still an ongoing issue, and in particular, what I've even covered in my own work, the effect it's had on legitimate pain patients, cancer patients, those with disabilities, and their inability to get access to pain medicine by something called the CDC's 2016 prescribing guidelines, which put out all these different kinds of rules that the states interpreted, which meant that they were supposed to limit access to opioid pain medication. Well, the CDC was supposed to fix that. We finally got the guidelines back. It took them 7 years, and they are a mixed bag to say the least. And there are some major issues there, and it's grossly underreported. There isn't much of a media appetite right now to talk about what's happening to pain patients, their inability to get medicine, the problem of the overdose crisis. Some of it got talked about with the big Biden crack pipe story, but I mean, those things are almost criminally underreported, and they affect a whole lot of people.
And Addison Hosner, why don't you bring us home with your most underreported story of the week?
Well, of course, I got to give you a lawsuit. Right now,
the lawyer wants to talk about a lawsuit.
The Supreme Court has taken an interesting case, and I think at any other time in a slow news cycle, this would be top tier. 303 Creative versus Lanus. It's a case that's going to be going to the Supreme Court once again from Colorado. That's pitting a person exclaiming their religious liberty over refusal for having to create a website for a same-sex couple for their wedding. This is another interesting case out of Colorado. We also had the Masterpiece, a cake shop, about the cake in the gay couple getting married. This case is going to have major implications on freedoms of speech, religion, and then, of course, whether religion, I've been saying this for quite some time, can be weaponized as a way to discriminate. And you can then use the First Amendment as a way to discriminate against individuals, since sexuality is not constitutionally protected. So I think it's going to have great implications. And then, of course, with the whole backdrop of us missing a Supreme Court justice on the bench at this time in the nomination, it's going to be Absolutely a battle, I imagine. And with a very right-leaning Supreme Court, I'm not holding my breath for civil liberties to win out in this one. But look it up.
Well, it sounds like
Equality Act.
Well, thank you. It sounds like one that we could be discussing on the Square Circle here in the future, but that is all we have time for this week. I want to thank our guests, Peter Pischke, Edwith Theogene, Addison Hosner. Thank you very much. And thank you for watching or listening to the Square Circle. I'm Adam Bearne. Please do subscribe to our channel and like this video or give it a 5-star rating on your podcast platform or any of those other things. Edwith's given us the big 5-star hand signal there. Yes, please, 5 stars if you would. Thank you very much for watching again. We'll see you next week.